Recently, there's been a lot of talks about stable versus rolling releases, and this is sort of the traditional way of splitting up Linux distros. So a stable release is going to be something where you download that version of, let's say, Ubuntu or Debian, and the version of the packages you get is the only version you get until the next update to the distro actually comes out, whether that is a minor update or a major update, which in a lot of cases does require a reinstall. Whereas a rolling release, basically you download the operating system, and then as the applications get updated, you can download those updates basically as soon as they're made available. This would be things like Arch Linux, Manjaro, Void Linux, Gentoo. But when it comes to stable releases, the idea of an actual stable release, one where you download the version of the ISO, and you don't get any updates until the next version of the distro actually comes out, is slowly starting to disappear. For example, if we take something like Pop! OS, if we are only working with these two categories, technically Pop! OS is a stable release. It has a stable base that doesn't get updated until the next release of the distro, but things like drivers or third-party user space applications are absolutely rolling. And a lot of other distros traditionally thought of as stable releases follow this exact same model. Now, we can't call this a rolling distro, unlike some people have started to do. That's not accurate whatsoever. The kernel and other core software is not rolling. So I didn't coin this term, but I think it should see much more usage. This term is a semi-rolling or a semi-stable release. They mean the exact same thing. Choose whichever one you prefer. This is when you have parts of your distro being a stable release. For example, you have a stable kernel, you have stable core utils, and then user space stuff or drivers or anything like that, you then have as rolling. How much you want to have as rolling really depends on how you want to maintain the distro, but having some sort of mix like this makes it a semi-rolling release. Now, when you're mixing two paradigms like this, when it is done well, you can get a lot of really, really awesome benefits. But no matter how well it is made, there is always going to be some drawbacks you do get from doing a model like this. So let's start with the advantages. The most obvious advantage is the fact that the base packages, or whatever part of the distro has been made stable, you know if that version is stable when you install it today. If you install this exact same version on some other system, it is still going to be the exact same version of that program, and it will have the exact same functionality. While this idea may not be as important for general home usage, if you're doing something like server deployment or anywhere where knowing exactly what version of software is on your system is very important, this can massively improve the maintainability of this distro. But in the cases of packages that do roll, you'll always have a more up-to-date version than what would be on a true stable counterpart. While you might be equal the day the stable version releases its new update, very shortly after, maybe in a couple of weeks or a month or so, those versions will start to diverge to the point where there's going to be some noticeable differences between those two versions. And this can be really important for a home user where you might want to go and test out, say, I don't know, a new Firefox feature or a new OBS feature or something like this, where when working with the main repos on a true stable distro, that just would not be possible. But more importantly than that is newer hardware support. Let's say you just bought the new AMD GPU, and let's say AMD just released a new GPU architecture. It's almost certain that unless the drivers were built with that newer architecture in mind, you will actually need a driver update to make sure that card actually functions. Maybe it'll barely function, but to have it function to its full capacity, you will need a newer version of the drivers. On a true stable release, you might have to wait 2-3 months for that to happen, but in the case of something like Pop! OS where the drivers are rolling, you might get support for that, you know, in a week, however long it takes for the drivers to actually be written. Now, because you are getting a lot more updates, you may see some of these packages that are rolling be potentially unstable from time to time, but I'm going to consider this to actually be an advantage in some cases. If you have a true stable release that ships with a broken version of the application, that is going to be broken until the next release of the OS. But if you have a broken version that is broken just for one little version, that might be fixed within a day or within a week. While you might have more instances of there being broken applications, you have a lot more instances to actually recover from it. One advantage over a fully rolling release, though, is you're far less likely to just break the system if you wait a really, really long time between updates. So in the case of something like Arch Linux, this is a fully rolling release. If you were to wait maybe, I don't know, 6 or 9 months to actually make a system update, you're gonna have a lot of dependency changes, there'll be some name changes, maybe some keys will change, and having all of these things happen at once can cause some pretty big issues, and it may lead to your kernel not installing properly. But if we're not rolling the kernel, having a full system breakage like this probably won't happen. Maybe you'll break some stuff in the user space, or you'll break some stuff that isn't super important, but fully breaking the system and having to do a reinstall or fix everything from the installation ISO is far, far less likely. As I did mention, though, there are some pretty big disadvantages. So the first obvious one is that because we have some rolling packages, obviously we'll have a lot more updates to actually do. Rather than having to go and update the application every 6 months. Instead, when those applications get updates, we'll have to go and download them. And in a lot of cases, if it's something like Firefox or Chromium, these can be fairly large updates. Also, because you do have these rolling updates, while you do have the advantage of a stable base, you can't really assume that everything on that distro is going to have a specific version. Once again, with Arch Linux, I can go and download an ISO right now, and this is going to be the exact same version of Arch as someone who is 10 years of updates ahead of me, because Arch Linux doesn't actually have a version. So when you're looking at these applications that are rolling, it's best to think of this collective of applications as not having a version either. This isn't a big deal for regular people. But in the case of software development, this can make it so you have to assume a massive range of applications. In the case of server management, if your server software gets updated, now you have to worry about, okay, which version am I actually running now? Are any of my configs now broken? These are things that are worth worrying about. And because a part of the distro is stable, that version of the distro is eventually going to hit its end of life. So at some point, you're going to stop getting things like security patches that will make that version of the kernel really, really unsafe to continue running. So you'll be forced to actually do a reinstall and go up to the newer version. Now, any sort of sensibly made distro is going to have an integrated tool to make that process basically seamless, where it looks like it's not even a reinstall, it looks kind of like an update. But ultimately, there will be a reinstall that needs to be done. Okay then, so what about a use case? Well, I mentioned Pop! OS, and what sort of people generally use Pop! OS? That's going to be Linux gamers. And I think that a semi-rolling release probably is one of the easiest ways to get into gaming on Linux. If we go with a fully stable release, you're going to have your drivers get outdated, and while it might not stop you from playing the games, you may not get the best performance actually possible from your hardware on newer titles. Or any use case where you're using the latest hardware. And I don't just mean gaming in this case. This could be game development, general programming, some sort of research use case where you're working with something that has dependencies that you won't really find on something that is truly stable. Or even if you just want to have a stable set of core packages and not worry about things like kernel updates, but still get updates to things like, say, your web browser or your editor or all of the other applications that you generally are going to be thinking about. In short, getting a lot of the benefits that a rolling release does offer without having to deal with the issue of managing a rolling release. Now, that's not to say that managing something like Arch Linux is actually difficult. It's not like it just breaks every other day, but when Arch does break, a lot of the time it's going to be a problem that is really difficult or really annoying to deal with, and I can totally get why some people don't even want that to be a possibility of something happening. Now, technically, we could take the idea of a semi-rolling release and then flip it upside down, where instead of having a stable core and then rolling third-party packages, we have a rolling core and stable third-party packages. Now, this would be an amusing experiment just to see how long your user space would actually function I don't know if there is a actual distro release like this, but what I do know is this is not a practical model. If someone wants to do it as an experiment, go ahead and do so, but please don't make it like a distro you recommend. In my mind, the best all-rounder first Linux distro is probably something that is a semi-rolling release. That doesn't mean that it is the best first Linux distro. If you don't know anything else about the person, a good general recommendation is something that is semi-rolling, like, for example, Pop! OS. This is without knowing if the person is a very techie person and wants to mess around with their system and would be happy on something like, say, Manjaro instead, or if they just want a computer that functions and they don't care about anything else, in which case something actually stable might be a better option. I would like to see a much more widespread usage of this term. I noticed a lot of people in places like Reddit describing certain distros as kinda rolling and kind of stable. Stop doing that. There's a word for that. It's semi-rolling. It is much easier to say. And if this term starts getting much more usage, people are going to be very understanding of what it actually means. And if you are a distro maintainer or in contact with a distro maintainer that has a distro that is actually a semi-rolling release, please just start referring to it as a semi-rolling release. There's nothing wrong with it being like that. It's a much more accurate way to describe what your project actually is. I wouldn't want to go and download something with the idea that it's stable when in reality, it's actually partially rolling. If I want a stable distro, I want a stable distro. I would like to keep terms like stable and rolling actually meaning what they are supposed to mean. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Maybe you completely disagree with me and just want rolling and stable just to have no meaning and let people just describe their distros as whatever they want. I don't think that's a good idea, but if you can defend that position, I would certainly like to see that. That's going to be it for me, and if you'd like to support the channel and become one of these amazing people over here, please go check out my Patreon, subscribe to LiberaPay, linked in the description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea, available basically anywhere. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays, where I live stream twice a week and upload about 5 or so YouTube shorts, and then this channel is also available over on Odyssey. That's going to be it for me, and I'm out.